3, 2, 1.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, A Practitioner's Guide to Achieving Automated Compliance on AWS. My name is Holger Schulze, and I'll be your host today as Dome9's customer Eric Hoffman, president of Datastream Connexion, discusses what to consider when automating compliance in the cloud, along with Patrick Pushor, Dome9's technical evangelist. As an early cloud adopter, Eric will discuss how cloud security has evolved and what to consider in your cloud migration strategy today. Now, before we get started, let's go over a few quick housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them using the questions window on your GoToWebinar panel. You can submit questions at any time during the webinar, and we will collect your questions and answer them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Also, please feel free to download the PDFs we posted for you in the handout section of your GoToWebinar console, including the Dome9 Compliance and Governance Product Brief and the Dome9 Datastream Connexion case study. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we will make the recording available to you right after the webinar. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenters. First, I would like to introduce Eric Hoffman, President at Datastream Connexion. Welcome, Eric.
Good afternoon. Glad to be here.
And next, I would like to welcome Patrick Pushor, Technical Evangelist at Dome9 Security. Hello, Patrick.
Hi, Holger. Hi, Eric. Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in.
Again, my name is Holger Schulze, and some of you may know me from the 370,000 member information security community that I manage on LinkedIn. All right, let's get started. Now, Eric, can you tell us about your move to the cloud and how the transition worked out for you and Datastream Connexion? Eric?
Yeah, good afternoon. It's a really interesting scenario that we went through. We were building web application products. We started building some large ones that were intended to be nationally utilized in the federal space in 2004. As we kept building and attracting usership, we kept growing. And at the time, we were in a kind of a co-location scenario in which we had our applications distributed across colos around the country. And as we grew, it became really costly for us to continue to do so. It was problematic to manage the infrastructure, to really maintain a tight-knit security with the tooling that was available back then. When we think about the idea of trying to improve our security in terms of compliance, back then, you might remember that getting a WAF in place was a hardware product in a colo and was 5 figures. And if we were trying to replicate that across multiple colos, that was going to be a very expensive proposition. So what we were looking for was more reliability, a lot of ease of use and redundancy, and improving security, actually. We also wanted to kind of capture some early adopter support, working with Amazon Web Services teams early on, trying to find the best paths forward. And really the bottom line for this, outside of security, is also compliance. We really wanted to work with the compliance inheritance to help with our HIPAA, our federal mandates, and those items going forward. You know, from what we looked at this, security of the many is easier than security of the one for us, is kind of was our mantra going forward. And when we're doing this and working with compliance, the biggest threshold or the biggest hurdle we hit was that our costs kept going up, and we were known for innovation, and it was slowing us down significantly. So that really led us to try to think about moving to the cloud.
You know, Eric, it's interesting that you mentioned sort of improving security as some of the motivation for that move to the cloud. I think that, you know, from my take, from the experience collectively we have at Dome9, I think practitioners are only now starting to really understand the truth in that statement, that perhaps these infrastructure as a service platforms can offer us more, not less, in terms of security. And I'm curious, back in the early days of that adoption cycle, did anyone think you were sort of crazy for considering that fact? I mean, just now we're starting to sort of feel that. I would imagine back then when you started this journey that there were naysayers.
Yeah, and there was no doubt that from that perspective, federal clients, and just even sitting around roundtable discussions with security folks, that the idea that we could more effectively manage our own hardware, things that we could touch, see, and feel, was going to be more secure going forward. And my argument had been the idea that as a team, we don't have 1,000 engineers reviewing security and reviewing traffic patterns and really on top of things across a large infrastructure, whereas Amazon Web Services, for example, as a cloud provider, does. It made more sense to me in my head to say that they are probably going to be better at securing the infrastructure, the facilities, and everything else than we are as a team. And so I think that slowly, as you mentioned, happened over time, but it did take a long time before that has now become kind of a common idea that the security of the many is better than security of the one. And so when we look at our path going forward, if we kind of think about what we had to do, working with the federal side, Amazon Web Services recognized a need there and created something called GovCloud, and that was brand new in 2011. So while we started out in the cloud before that testing things, we weren't really doing anything in production quite yet. GovCloud, though, was an opportunity to create a U.S. government-only area to deploy our applications into. And there was a lot of pushback, to your point, Patrick, saying that, well, that's not secure, and who's managing security and what's happening. And socialization for us was key to build trust, to talk about these kind of scenarios about why we can build security better, how we can manage compliance better, who the vendors are in the space that can really help us. And so we were seeking vendors and partners that understood our needs, and Dome9 was one that they implemented GovCloud access for us to really help us during this process. And what we were doing during that time was assessing, how is our large portal and SaaS application going to migrate to the cloud? There's probably plenty of folks on this call who are in this situation in which they've got a large existing infrastructure, and that migration path is concerning, especially around visibility into the network, security, and compliance. And for us, how are we going to protect legacy and new code hybrids? This classic architecture, we got to transition this into the cloud. How are we going to understand what's happening in the plumbing of things? How is data being transited? How is it being managed and secured? And so for us, our path would have probably stopped there, and we would not have been an early adopter necessarily, but we looked at the Dome9 Arc platform as a way to get that quintessential single pane of glass to kind of look at what was happening inside of our AWS infrastructure, not just east and west where we're doing piloting and development, but our production workloads in GovCloud. So that was really important for us.
It's interesting you mentioned that term single pane of glass. I think it can mean different things to different people, and certainly I think some feel it's kind of this overused, overvalued perspective. So I mean, what did it mean for Datastream Connexion? What was the value that unified perspective of all of your, the current state of your infrastructure, your security, sort of situational awareness? What did that single view really sort of give you?
And we think back from the previous days of, I manage a single box, and I've acquired that box, I've procured it, I've put it online, and I know that box exists. In the cloud, we come with transient instances, transient servers, transient images that come and go. How are we going to manage that? How are we going to understand what's happening in our infrastructure? And now thinking about microservices, we need to secure and manage those. Thinking about how am I going to look at all this? I can't go from product to product to product to product to try to understand this. I really need to see everything in one big roll-up dashboard to have a really high-level overview of what's happening and be able to drill down into things. And so for that was incredibly important for us going forward at a starting point. We just natively understood that we can approach this by working with a lot of different vendors, or we can go with Dome9 and have that single view of all these different processes happening inside of AWS infrastructure, and more importantly, an agentless approach, right? We didn't have to install an agent on everything. We could utilize Dome9's capabilities to kind of provide all that visibility for us. So Holger, I mean, those are some of the barriers for us. What are the biggest barriers that your research has revealed, that's holding back faster cloud adoption today versus us when we were starting out?
Great question, Eric. Now, in our cloud security survey, right, that we conducted earlier this year with the 370,000 member InfoSec community on LinkedIn, we specifically asked survey participants, about the biggest barriers holding back faster cloud adoption. And this is where it gets interesting. Among all barriers, cloud security risks still top the list of barriers to faster cloud adoption. And this is followed by a lack of staff and expertise to manage cloud security, and also by regulatory compliance concerns, right, as key barriers to cloud adoption. Just to highlight a few. Now, Eric and Patrick, let me ask you this: are you seeing the same type of barriers, and what role does compliance play among the top cloud adoption hurdles?
I like to think of compliance as being is a byproduct of having a good security practice in the first place. Compliance, if we are approaching security from a practical point, a defense in depth strategy, compliance is something to help guide us where we need to go, but that's what we end up being because we have these opportunities. And the security risks is still, I think, number one, because it is important. You hear stories, right, Patrick, of this was missed or that happened or just a small misconfiguration happened in the cloud. But I think sometimes people don't realize that was still true back in your own data centers, your own colos, right? But compliance, from a perspective of, do I have to manage the compliance of the infrastructure and who comes in and out of my data centers and all those pieces? It's very different today. Would you agree with that, Patrick?
I definitely would, and in a lot of ways, it's not that surprising to me that especially mandated compliance is still one of the largest barriers, right? I think organizationally we're still struggling with this from a vendor tooling perspective in a lot of cases, and certainly in a third-party tool set sort of capability as well, right? Trying to provide the sort of perspective that compliance requires. Many technologies exist from a workload or a virtual machine perspective. I think you just talked about in the last slide, in the last discussion, Eric, around being agent-based back then. We still find a lot of that now. We find a lot of vendors that served us in the data center where we didn't have services to consume. We had everything loaded in a virtual machine or hardware, and so the platform nature of these as a service environments means that we struggle to understand all of that service consumption as well. Databases as a service, serverless computing like Lambda from AWS, if you're familiar. These are services that an agent approach simply ignores, right? And that doesn't provide a lot of confidence to the compliance seeker. And then sort of on the other side of that, even if we find the right tool set that has the right perspective, that finds the deviations, across all of the services we consume, how do we then remediate in a timely and responsive manner? We see that the number 2 point here saying that one of the other top barriers is, resourcing and expertise. We can find the tool set now that will surface these up to the top, but then how do we fix them? How do we solve the deviances from our desired baseline that we're seeking?
I think number 2 was for us very much a consideration, given frankly the explosive growth of what Amazon's web services offers, the breadth of it, and you look at the other clouds, it is really a struggle to keep up with that, and we chose to look at this as an opportunity versus a hindrance. And I think number 2, though, is forefront in a lot of people's minds.
Definitely.
Thank you. And in our cloud security survey, just to follow up on that topic, we drilled deeper into the security concerns, right, to find out what specific issues keep CISOs up at night, if you will, to further illustrate the severity of this point. When we asked about the degree of cloud security concerns, over 80%, 8 out of 10 organizations said they are moderately to extremely concerned about cloud security. And the top 3 security headaches that we identified, they're fairly closely grouped together, and some of these we already touched on, starting with visibility into cloud infrastructure security, right, being the single biggest security management headache for 37% of respondents. By the way, moving up to the number 1 top spot from being the second ranking concern last year. Followed by compliance, again, right, coming in as a close second at 36%, also moving up from, I think it was the number 3 spot in the previous survey. And setting consistent security policies is the 3rd biggest headache at 33%. Now, while none of these cloud management headaches really are surprises, right? It might seem surprising, to me at least, that many of these issues continue to be perennial concerns, if you will, right? Looking for solutions to deliver on the promise of cloud computing. On this note, Eric, let me ask you this: do these challenges and these security headaches, do they reflect what you see in your daily operations, Eric?
Yeah, and I think if we were to categorize what keeps me up at night, regardless, these are still very serious concerns, and they're going to be the ones that I'm asked about most often by healthcare providers, by our federal clients, is how do you know what's happening? Are you meeting your compliance? And then I think about setting consistent security policies. We just heard in the last 2 weeks where somebody made a mistake and a lot of data was available through an S3 bucket, right? So these things can happen, these mistakes can happen. And so those are the things that make me consistently kind of review our processes going forward. So there's no doubt those are the top three for me in general.
And I'm curious, Eric, as a follow-on, outside of general visibility into security, compliance remains the top cloud adoption barrier. I think recognizing that compliance can mean different things to different organizations. Where do you think the challenge sort of truly lies, right? For me, the statement around lack of visibility into infrastructure security and the challenge of compliance go hand in hand. I think it was a few slides ago where you said a good compliance posture starts with a good security posture in general, which likely, at least in my hand as I think through the problem, starts with that complete visibility of an environment that can be very, very dynamic, right? Is that the root of the problem from your perspective?
I think you hit the nail on the head. That dynamic environment that you're in the cloud does become, well, both a tremendous growth opportunity and innovation capability for your firm. It also has pitfalls and risks into it. And so understanding in a finite detail what your infrastructure is doing, how it's set up, how traffic is transiting into what's happening on it day to day, that visibility is really important. And compliance allow that continuous monitoring framework, the idea that compliance is no longer a check a box and review it every 3 years. The requirements are a continuous, ongoing operational visibility into what's happening and monitoring and managing the risks. And so you really have to understand what your infrastructure is before you can achieve compliance. So it's really one of those building blocks for us as well. So I think you hit the nail on the head with that.
Yeah, and I think that different use cases and different communities have different but overlapping challenges as they move to infrastructure as a service environments, right? I mean, SecOps teams have generally wide responsibility of different security control planes, right? Network and service security, which includes challenges like network service exposure, maybe overexposure, firewall exception handling, and mapping identity and access controls to resources, for example. On the flip side of that, at the bottom of the slide, DevOps have similar concerns, but often are looking to automate processes around them in an effort to produce and publish quality software, right? So working with security capabilities and tool sets in a non-interactive way. Continuous integration and delivery mean that likely processes already exist that test and push software to its final destination, and security must be incorporated into that pipeline to ensure that reliable delivery of software. And then kind of in the middle are the compliance and governance seekers that is kind of the overarching discipline that needs the widest visibility across the entire org in order to be able to measure all of those conditions that are important to an organization, right, from external mandated security standard perspectives or in an attempt to prove security competency to other internal stakeholders within an organization, right? And that demands an approach that includes all infrastructure as a service usage, right, which necessarily includes the use of or excludes the use of software agents or appliances like we've talked about. They really only consider those traditional virtual machines. We call them instances within AWS. I think those seeking compliance and governance also understand that their challenge is always on, right? Meaning that rather than responding to requests or securing an established process, their job is discovering deviations in configuration across the entire infrastructure and identity and access management control planes. So I think each group is similar, yet the specific goals of each differs enough to be sort of considered on their own.
I think this really highlights well that interconnectedness between all these scenarios and these issues, right? You don't have simple buckets or simple challenges. You address this, you've got that. You address issue number 2, you've got that fixed. You go to issue 3. Everything is very, very interconnected here. From the detailed audit trails, that's a compliance issue, but from your DevOps process, you really understand what happened and who did what when. And then that rolls back into just how do you have your identity management set up? Are you really managing things well there? And who can touch things within your infrastructure? So the challenge is that it's just not a simple process. Everything is so intertwined that you really have to become savvy in terms of how to follow all this. And again, back to that original point I made earlier about that single pane of glass, it is really helpful to be able to have some landing spot to start your discovery and understanding what's happening, right?
That makes a lot of sense.
If I think about, from our AWS setup, it's just to kind of highlight this. We're not on a single production workload. We're not in one spot in AWS and having a good time, right? We have multiple AWS accounts across multiple clients that we maintain. And we're not just in the public, quote-unquote, AWS infrastructure in the US East, West, Ireland, or other places. We're also in GovCloud, which has its own specific mandates around management for that. And we have a mixture of federal, healthcare, academic, and startups that we work with. So we have a lot of varying mandates there from a compliance. And even more so, we decided some time back to move all of our operations from our own internal data center out of our offices and colos up into AWS as well. So we have no more internal data center. Everything works up in AWS itself. And so because of all this, our AWS setup is fairly extensive for what it is, and we use a broader way of these services. So inside of public AWS, meaning US East, West, that most folks are familiar with, that's 27 different services, I should say. And inside of GovCloud itself, which is ever expanding in terms of what it offers, we're now using 17 services there inside of GovCloud. And so when I think about this, I've got in S3 130 S3 buckets that all need to be secured and be consistent, and policies are aligned and can be validated that they're actually operating, that nobody's made a mistake and checked the box and left a bucket open to the public, for example, right? We've got servers that are these instances, as you mentioned, coming and going. So as we're scaling and we're building things, these instances start up, they leave. They start up, they leave, doing blue-green deployments. So we don't have just the same instance setup running day to day. And you mentioned earlier Lambda, and that's a really important thing to talk about. We're going to be reaching 100 Lambda functions here soon. And people think about Lambda as just set it and forget it. I put the code up. We have to remember to secure those Lambda functions. And there's really an important process there that I think is not talked about. Everybody gets excited about serverless computing, but they forget about the security around those Lambda scripts themselves, because there are some complexities there as well. And just the top level bottom line, we have 429 security group policies across all of this. So in fact, we have an approach that we're very explicit in what we allow in our infrastructures across all these clients. We whitelist everything first. So we really try to take that whitelist approach first across the firewall, the WAF, down to the application rules on an EC2 instance. But it becomes very complex to manage all that. And again, how are you going to, take care of that at that speed, going forward without something like this from Dome9?
Yeah, and I think that getting excited about the new scale potential of AWS is really common. We see that in DevOps scenarios too. I mean, what you can do based on that pragmatic leveraging of an API, sort of, so that you don't have to build new processes, you can integrate the infrastructure into your existing ones. That's very appealing. Yet, as you suggest, what often gets missed, at least at the start, is the security around all these new ways to consume and work with data, right? And as you mentioned, your scale, certainly the number of resources, the number of security groups, the number of Lambda functions is, does convey that amount of scale. But what strikes me is this breadth of nearly 30 AWS services. When we think of cloud security, we often think of firewalls, permissions attached to users, and in our case now with AWS resources as well. Concepts that we're familiar with back from our data center days. Your breadth of service consumption from AWS means that, especially early on, you must have struggled to find processes and tools that consider the widest range of them, right? For again that unified perspective across all of them.
No, that's absolutely true. I think we rightly call this at the beginning a journey, right? The AWS journey into the cloud, and it's tough to elucidate really well what it means to have 27 services in a compared to what it used to be in the old days. For us, having that kind of that engine that can go look into what's happening across all these services and capabilities is incredibly helpful for us, so we understand what's happening where, and the different mandates we have. This ability to look at FedRAMP capabilities with the 853 requirements there from NIST, or HIPAA compliance and how we're going to meet that, or even just down to, I don't say down too lightly, but PCI compliance and those types of pieces. We need to have that really big, wide open view of everything that's happening across the infrastructure. So it is really important to us. Looking at just network visibility, in the old days, we had tools that on our on-prem services and the colos, we had tools that would map everything out. Not only would we get a nice inventory list, but we'd also have a beautiful little diagram that showed how everything's working. And that was really important for compliance reporting, that we could demonstrate, here's the raw way this is set up, and here is the nice picture of how it looks for the auditors to look at. And we really need to have parity in the cloud. We need to be able to report that list. We need to have a visual representation of the architecture and how information was flowing across the boundaries. And so we needed that in the cloud as well. And so inside of Dome9 and the alerts and policy reports, this area, we found a lot of that, in which we could see what was operating where, how the data was transiting across those boundaries, and then getting alerts on activities or challenges that we're seeing along there. Especially looking at traffic flows, that's really important if you want to know if your security groups are running right. It helps to have a visual representation of this information starts here, transits this boundary, goes to here, transits that boundary, and make sure it's actually working. And moreover than anything, make sure anything new is not operating that you didn't authorize, right?
Absolutely.
So I think from that perspective, that kind of leads into almost a little bit of DevOps. So Holger, I was kind of wondering from your perspective, what impact you see security having on DevOps? Do you have data specifically from your cloud security survey, since we're ourselves going heavily into DevOps?
Yes, we do. Thanks, Eric. A great question. And yeah, there's certainly a lively debate going on right around DevOps and security, and how to integrate robust cloud security with, without the two working in opposition, right, if you will. And 37% of respondents in our cloud security survey said that security for them slows down continuous development methods like DevOps, and another 19% noted that security actually is completely ignored, right, in their DevOps process. Agility and accelerated deployments are among the key cloud adoption benefits, right, and promises of the DevOps approach. Yet security slows down DevOps. Now, Eric, how does this align with your DevOps experience, and how do we reconcile, DevOps and security for the cloud?
I agree. The idea of moving to DevOps and the value that we gain from that interoperability between the development operations teams, the ability to move things forward, immediately hits a brick wall with that security and the ability to ensure that each step and process is managed and auditable. And whether you're going to do it through policies inside your organization, use APIs to automate things in AWS. Those are all challenges, and security definitely slows it down originally. But I think we found through Dome9 and some internal processes a way to make this go forward in which we could achieve security and continuation of the, the holy grail of what DevOps can offer. That's the easiest way to say it. So Patrick, do you see the same on automation API, that type of thing that I'm talking about?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think with DevOps, we often see that emphasis on automation to accomplish the goals of that group and to take advantage of the capabilities really within AWS, for example, of software-defined anything, right? Everything's an API call away, and in the absence of non-interactive controls, like we've been talking about, leaning on the API. Is the API coverage of security tools a significant contributor to your selection of Dome9? I mean, sure, I would imagine that because of the platform itself, AWS is almost an API first kind of solution, right? We see API coverage, if not first, at the very same time we see the interactive side of a feature debut. How many security tools can sort of say the same thing? And I imagine that was part of your interest in Dome9, if not starting with DevOps first, as soon as you sort of got to that point.
Yeah, I think that was a natural progression for us as we moved along the journey in the cloud, as we went from traditional ways of handling software development into the realization of what DevOps means. But we did see some challenges ourselves, and one of the, probably not very different from a lot of folks, that we have highly mobile development teams and management teams, meaning we've got people not only in different locations that are part of the development teams, we also have those of us that are part of development and operations that actually travel. And so we're at conferences, we're at speaking engagements, doing these types of things. We need point-in-time access. So we need to have an ability to request dynamic access for a half hour, 1 hour to the very point location I'm in. And I needed Dome9 to be able to call across that API boundary back in AWS and change that security group and say, this is now authorized at this IP location to make sure I could grant it in. And then Dome9 could follow up at the expiration of that point-in-time access, reach back out into Amazon Web Services and remove that rule from the security groups. So it became a very important piece for us to ensure that we were continuing to be able to be responsive in our infrastructure, nimble, despite a very wide-flowing development team and team on the road. And who can do that? So we want to have role-based access for different user types for who could perform what activity, who could get leases and grants from where. And this is all great. So if we are able to manage point-in-time access, we're able to ensure who can do what, and Dome9 helps us do all that. At the back end of that, though, we need to understand what happened historically. We need to have audit logs. And so we use the audit log functionality and alerting in Dome9 to actually understand what happened when, to be able to go back and look at things. But all this wrapped up into one is this empowered capability for both our operations deployment teams, where we can have a validation of any changes that are done, the tamper protection that Dome9 offers to say, this is an authorized change that we can have happen. If not, it's going to self-heal it. We have an audit history of those changes, and coming back to look around that we identify sensitive ports. We want to make sure that these ports never get opened. If they do, Dome9 will shut it down. So again, Dome9, which I think is very, very cool, which is one of the very first things that really helped us talking with our federal clients, was in the case of a mistake in a firewall or a security group setting, Dome9 can reach back in and remediate that. And can say, nope, now we're back to our known good state for that security group. And that is a very important thing when we have this kind of DevOps conversation where you have multiple people starting to have more permissions than traditionally available. And one example we found, AWS has an Elastic File Service called EFS that was being used in our development environment by a couple developers who wanted to play with that. And that wasn't an explicitly authorized service to use quite yet, as we had not walked around that, but we saw it pop up. And we saw it available inside of Dome9, and it was able for us to go look at it, how that happened, and go ahead and have a discussion. So it wasn't a critical problem, but it was the idea of how Dome9 helped us have visibility into that change in AWS and track that back. One thing I want to highlight sometimes that in this idea of point-in-time access and dynamic access, managing that in AWS is very, very difficult when you have as many security groups as we've got. It is incredibly empowering, and we thank Dome9 for this, having IP lists. Something so simple makes security group management be an incredibly huge time saver. So we can actually identify, create an IP list and assign that to security groups. And Dome9 will walk across that API and put all those IPs in the security groups for us. And so if we need to modify our IP list for these different groups we've got, we just make the change in the IP list, and it flows through to all the different security groups in Dome9. And there's no way we'd want to do that on a manual basis, right? So that is incredibly helpful for us.
Sort of a security at scale kind of convention, right?
Oh, that's absolutely right, because it's impossible for us to manage this without that kind of capability. And so all this is talking about, we're checking this, we're auditing that, we're ensuring that users have proper roles and access rights. And Holger, I wonder, what are the biggest compliance concerns that are coming from your research around all this?
Yeah, our research actually shows that as organizations mature their cloud adoption, compliance really becomes a bigger headache, right? Starting with audit and reporting considerations, followed by contractual legal responsibilities, and concerns about an inability to meet specific compliance requirements. Eric, from your day-to-day experience, how do you recommend organizations implement compliance mandates and meet those requirements?
That's the million-dollar question, right? All the time. How do you do this? I think from the very start, if you're just starting your migration path or you're already in the cloud, you have to have a thorough look first inside your organization to understand what your capabilities are, and where do you have gaps when you're looking at what the cloud requires. If you're looking at audit and reporting requirements, what do you do today? What's going to change when you go to the cloud? What are your responsibilities versus what is the cloud provider's responsibility, in this case Amazon, that shared security model? Do you understand what that means and how you're going to meet that? And then looking at very specific requirements that your infrastructure needs. Those are all important things, and I think that what we did for ourselves was take that time to take that look into what we had and where we needed to go and map that out, and then sought out a vendor who would help us fill those gaps. And so before we made the move in any significant fashion, we identified and partnered with the right vendors we felt to ensure that we had that security blanket, maybe is a fair way to say it, so that we knew that going from our existing on-prem sort of environment, moving up to the cloud, we didn't lose significant functionality. In fact, to my original point, security, well, the many is better than security than one, we felt better because we had Dome9 monitoring and managing what was happening in our infrastructure. We had AWS security teams managing, the global infrastructure of AWS, and we could focus on our instances and our software applications. So I think having that process going forth is really important, and defining those rules as an organization. I mean, do you kind of agree with that, Patrick, from what you've seen?
Yeah, I think defining those rules, maybe in my perspective, with the Dome9 customers I've worked with, I think we often see data security standards include the what, right, in terms of these rules. In the case of PCI, which is something probably people are most familiar with, you must segregate networks with cardholder data from others. Well, that tells you what you must do, but the how, right? How do we do this? Very, very little of that is often suggested, which leaves the organization trying to comply with a significant gap in understanding regarding how to put these controls in place. And I wonder, Eric, how effective is an approach to compliance that makes assumptions around the how, kind of in their built-in rule set, versus maybe that plus giving the end user the flexibility to define some of that how themselves?
So this probably has to be one of my favorite parts of looking at Dome9's compliance engine and governance suite, the challenge of automating our compliance. From our perspective, we really wanted to look at integrated tooling. There is a lot of vendors out there that can do X or another vendor could do Y, but we wanted to have everything, again, back to that single pane of glass. I want to understand our compliance posture. I wanted to see how that related to existing audit logs, VPC flow logs. I wanted to understand how that related back. But I wanted to be able to communicate all this information that's coming from so many different locations in AWS back to Dome9 in a simple manner. So I wanted a dashboard that I could just simply, again, take that picture and have a discussion with a stakeholder, with an auditor about where we're at, what our position is, what our opportunities for improvement are. And there is this scenario, especially within the federal sector we've dealt with, that some agencies have a slightly different flavor of requirements. So what's fantastic is we can use these canned built-in compliance reporting capabilities in Dome9 to look at best practices, to understand if we're meeting the CIS best practices. We can use this as a baseline for aligning ourselves against those. We can also then go in and change them. We can clone one of those assessments and make modifications to it. We can go in and write our own language against some of those to say, here's something additional that we need to report on or we need to call out specifically, and use that capability. And now that is very, very important to us as we demonstrate our compliance to a healthcare system versus a federal agency versus an academic institution who has their own set of security requirements. So having that flexibility built into Dome9 has been incredibly important to us, but also I don't want to miss the point of how important the dashboards are for the ability to communicate to the folks who have to understand what you're doing as being very, very important. And so for us, it assists us for sure in alignment to FedRAMP. You know, the idea of being able to catching misconfigurations in S3 or CloudTrail or all these other services I mentioned is absolutely critical for us.
Yeah, and you mentioned this need to satisfy, you know, legal, regulatory data security standards, and then you know, sometimes the less formal use case of providing or proving rather security competency to different audiences, and that's something we really find too. We find just as much growth in the, you know, whether it's internal stakeholders, whether it's industry not governed sort of officially by regulation, there's this need to have the best of both worlds, where I might take a HIPAA standard for the work I do with healthcare organizations. I might want to take that as a basis, but then customize it for, you know, education, for example, where I might not be governed quite as strictly, yet I still want to be able to prove to them with this kind of flexible way to define what's important to me, you know, through the reporting mechanisms, for example, that you find in Dome9.
Absolutely, I think that's a really good point, because that's something we run into often enough, and this has been a really helpful tool for us. And I think about the money we put into spending on compliance. It can be quite a bit of effort, and having a tool like this really simplifies that effort for us, just understanding the value of what we're doing day to day as an organization, securing AWS. You know, Holger, you know, I know what we're putting into what kind of resources we're doing to get behind cloud security and compliance, getting that done. But what does it look like, you know, with your research across, you know, a larger perspective?
Yeah, great question, Eric. Now, our research shows that about a third of organizations predict, you know, their security budgets to increase over the next 12 months. And just as an aside, with 33% increase, you know, cloud security is receiving the largest share of predicted budget increases across all IT security domains that we surveyed. Right, so this is significant. And although cloud providers, you know, each offer a suite of tools to help with security integration, it can still be very challenging for organizations to integrate tools, security tools natively, right, into an existing SecOps toolkit or directly with APIs, depending on the security program's maturity, right, their scope and goals and whatnot. Many organizations are finding, you know, third-party solutions necessary for full security, you know, lifecycle assessment, compliance, and GRC, with 79% of those surveyed allocating up to 15% of their budget for third-party security and compliance tools. Now, on that note, Patrick, let me ask you this. What is Dome9's experience regarding satisfying those, compliance and GRC requirements?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Really, for us, it's been our primary focus, I would say, for nearly the last year. We've taken that deep API integrated approach for the reasons we've been talking about in the webinar so far today, right? The broad spectrum of visibility you need to not just the consumption of workloads, spinning up a database inside a virtual machine, for example, but consuming those kind of offerings as services from AWS. So that deep API integration gives Dome9 that perspective. And if you're familiar with what we've done kind of on the traditional fundamental network security side, our perspective on the compliance side is much wider. And we're going to take a look at that in just a moment. So it's that, plus it's the ability to do remediation. And as Eric suggested earlier, these concepts like tamper protection. Certainly within the compliance engine, you will find deviations from your sort of quote-unquote golden standard policy or your mandated policy in many cases. But then, once you've got those understood and fixed, Dome9 also provides you a way to ensure that those stay fixed, right? Find it, fix it, keep it fixed is kind of the motto that we subscribe to. And so ensuring that that you can do that and then report on the whole thing. I think we just heard Eric talk about the importance of being able to share that information, and certainly the reporting capability of what we do on the compliance side is a big part of that. So we're going to look at that very shortly. So as we think about the flexibility required then, when we think about compliance as not meaning the same thing to everybody, the ability to both start from a standard, and Dome9 offers many of these standards. Today we're going to be looking at sort of healthcare HIPAA-centric controls and measuring the status of such. But certainly even there, in a dedicated security standard, you're never going to get quite as specific as many of our customers to do, right? They want to test for things that they're mandated to do, but they also want to test for things that are specific. The specific use of tags to do potential network segregation. That's something that you're never going to get in a pre-published standard. And so for that, we have a domain-specific language called Governance Specification Language, or GSL. And that is a Dome9 convention that's purpose-built to be able to, write these rules in as near of a plain English way as we can, with the whole intent of getting the policy creator closer to the rule itself. The alternative approach has been policy comes out, we convey that to somebody with a developer skill set, they write the rule, and if you've ever played this game of telephone as a child, you know that as we move a message kind of down the line from person to person or business function to business function, some of the nuance of that message invariably gets lost. And this is the problem we're trying to solve for in making this GSL language and making it relatively human readable. And of course there's a trade-off between that and the power of the language itself, and we think we've struck kind of the perfect balance, and we're going to look at that very shortly. Before we do, here's a good example of this sort of natural readability and the kinds of rules you can attest with Dome9, right? And I think just at a glance, even if you're not overly technical, I think you can understand what most of these rules say, right? Security group should have inbound rules, should have inbound rules. Actually, this should not have inbound rules with port 22, which is a very commonly used administrative port for a secure shell, being wide open, right? A scope of 0.0.0.0 means anybody can access that service. That's almost always a problem, and so being able to find that kind of rule, being able to test for that sort of condition with a near natural sort of language, that's not the description of the rule, that's the rule itself, right? Same thing with below, right? Where we get specific around any workload, any virtual machine or instance I have should be tagged with a certain key. Very, very easy to test for with Dome9. And so rather than maybe look at all these examples, let's now take a look at the feature itself. So I'm going to grab control away from our host for just a moment. While I do that, let me just get my screen prepared. Okay. Hopefully you should be seeing this very, very shortly. I've got my screen shared. And welcome to the Dome9 compliance engine. There are lots of other portions of Dome9 that certainly fit into the sort of compliance workflow, but today for a few minutes we're going to be focused on the compliance engine itself. And as you can see on the left-hand side, I have many pre-publish what we call bundles of policy, and these are simply bundles that include very, very specific measurements. I've got the HIPAA technical safeguards for AWS bundle that has 49 measurements in it selected. On the right-hand side, you can see that this is well beyond standard security group management, which was a traditional focus for Dome9, but you can see we've really expanded the perspective that this feature has. On the left-hand side under validation types, you can see all sorts of the kinds of different things we measure. Security groups is still there. We've still got you covered in terms of network service exposure, but now we measure much more. We measure user attributes. Are you following the best practice, the mandated practice in this case, of not using your all-empowered root account, for example? Do you have the proper logging out of AWS CloudTrail enabled? Are you rotating keys within AWS KMS in a timely manner? Or do you have account-wide multi-factor authentication turned on? These are the kinds of things you can test for within Dome9. And let's run a quick assessment while we talk. Just before we do, I'm going to turn on the Show GSL toggle. And this is where you can actually get, just like in the slide before, an idea of what these rules actually look like. I mean, it's not all that complicated to understand. What we're testing for here is this specific named user, IAM user in the case of AWS speak, of the root account should not have a password that's been in use for longer than 90 days. If you're not familiar with the language itself, we also have a guided process. We call that the rule builder, to be able to build these rules with hints from Dome9 along the way. But before we get there, let's just quickly run an assessment. We're going to do this against one of our accounts. You can run this across all of the accounts you manage with Dome9, and certainly, as Eric suggests, right, with a service consumption of nearly 30 services, that's likely spread across more than one AWS account, and so you can test them all at once. We're going to do it for one particular account. You can get a little more specific as well, right, just testing a particular region or a particular VPC. And it looks like my session is stale. I've had it open here for a moment. Let's do this again. Let's choose the rule bundle we want to run. I'll run the assessment against one particular account. And right away, you'll get a feel for the report that we've been talking about so far in the webinar. The report is really intended for two different audiences. It's intended for that manager or information aggregate view, where I'm concerned about my overall pass-fail ratio, and the report's just about drawn on my screen here. It'll probably take a few more moments to get through GoToWebinar to you folks. Here it is here. So here I can tell, again, kind of above half the page, I've got my overall pass-fail ratio. It looks like I didn't do very well with almost a 20% pass ratio only, almost 80% failed. I can understand by severity, and it looks like most of my failures are high severity, so that's even more concerning. I can understand against the kinds of entities I tested, right? In this case, I've got a lot of security group tests, I've got many instance-based tests, and then I've got S3 bucket tests, I've got IAM, identity and access management permissions, and sort of even by region I can understand how I'm doing. Right, so in this case, I've got almost the inverse. I've got 10 pass tests in my sole region, 2 failed. So maybe this is kind of the model, given my overall pass-fail ratio, that I should really be subscribing to in terms of how I manage my infrastructure. So that's the first audience that this report's really intended for. Down below, it's more the practitioner view, where every single test that we execute, you will find the results for, right? Whether we passed, whether we failed. We can do some filtering of that view here if we'd like, but really it's going to be walking down the list of tests and making sure that we're compliant. And you can see here, for example, verify that all user accounts are active. And we can look at the actual syntax of this rule, but here we've tested 25. We've got 22 that didn't comply, 22 different user accounts. I've got them listed here that aren't active, that haven't been logged in for a certain period of time. We'd have to look at the actual rule itself here. But this gives you a feel for the information being supplied back from the Dome9 compliance and governance engine. And so that's the first part, is getting to the information that matters, understanding those deviances away from your desired baseline. The second part of this, of course, is talking about the remediation, and certainly this is enough information to be useful in going and solving these problems manually. But we also have a system whereby you can take automated action, right? We call that project Cloud Supervisor, and it interfaces with the compliance engine, and then we'll take automated action based on the kind of entity that failed. If it's a user account, for example, that failed, we may want to say, for those user accounts that aren't active, that either haven't had passwords rotated or maybe haven't logged into the AWS console or been leveraged via the API, maybe we want to take those and quarantine those users for a short period of time so we can get to those users and really from a business perspective understand why this is, right? Doing that in an automated way such that, you know, users aren't paged or your trusted admins aren't paged in the middle of the night to go and first understand why the failure happened, go through the list of non-complying entities or failures and then decide what to do. We can take care of that for you. You know, do that remediation, make sure these accounts are safe, and then, you know, later have somebody come by and justify, okay, were these, you know, legitimately being sort of used for a different purpose? Maybe we haven't used these for a period of time, but we intend to, or, you know, in fact, do we have to take further action against all these quarantined users? So we have both of those capabilities, not just finding the information you need, but then you know, solving many of these problems in an automated fashion as well. And that project is called Cloud Supervisor, and we encourage you to take a look at that as well. So I think in the interest of time, I'm going to pass this back to our moderator, and hopefully that gives you a feel enough for the compliance engine from Dome9, how it works, the kinds of reports that it produces. I should mention that, you know, you saw me execute this in the along what I call the happy path, kind of interactively, but this is just as appropriate in automated environments as we've spoken about so far today in the webinar, whereby you may want to do compliance tests at, you know, the start of a change window, at the end of a change window. You can leverage the Dome9 API to do just that. Back to you.
Thank you, Patrick. Now let's answer a couple of live audience questions that are coming in. And as a quick reminder for our viewers, we want to hear from you. So please submit your questions through your GoToWebinar control panel. All right, let's see. The first question is about the Dome9 compliance engine. And the question is, how is the Dome9 compliance engine different than what AWS provides? Who wants to take this one?
I can grab that from a customer perspective. You know, the idea that AWS provides a lot of data, a lot of logs that are stored in S3. They're stored here. CloudTrail has its own audit logs. VPC has logs. Attempting to look at compliance, there's not really an overarching single pane of glass looking at what's happening inside AWS. It provides you the tools to understand what's happening, but you need something like Dome9 compliant engine to really look at what's happening in an aggregate fashion and in an actionable fashion in that one report, so you don't have to go digging around. And that's really important to us. So that's the difference between AWS and Dome9 to us. Patrick, I don't know if you have a different thought on that.
Yeah, no, I think maybe just a continuation. I think the aggregate nature is spot on. As you saw, you know, Dome9's perspective is multi-cloud accounts, AWS and more, right? The largest Dome9 customers have hundreds of AWS accounts connected to their single Dome9 account. And as you saw, we can run a compliance assessment across them all with one operation. And that's very powerful, right? Because often there's a lack of trust boundaries between accounts with concepts like VPC peering and embedded security group references across that peering relationship. You know, we get into, yeah, we're following the best practice of account segregation, but there are these dependencies and trusts between accounts that make a comprehensive compliance perspective very, very necessary and valuable. I would say too that AWS has a really good handle on host-based compliance with their inspector service, right? And I think that's where they really shine. I think where Dome9 shines again is in the reporting, right? We're leveraging AWS APIs, so I mean they've got the coverage to do a very similar test that we do. The difference is we'll take that result, both the information, both the passes and the failures, and give you actionable data in report format, right? The report that you need at that management or compliance officer level, yet still be able to take automated remediation steps, very flexible ones, either based on internal rules or the launching of your own custom Lambda functions to do that remediation in a very flexible way. So I think that's spot on.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Patrick. The next question is about scalability and multi-cloud environments. We touched on this a little bit, but maybe it makes sense to reiterate. The question is, how does Dome9 compliance scale, and how does it work in a multi-cloud environment?
Yeah, good question. I think it's a bit of a continuation on from the last question in terms of scale, right? We talk about the ability to serve many cloud accounts at once, or to get very specific if the question of compliance is quite a bit more specific in nature itself. But when we think about the multi-cloud scenario, which is more and more popular, right, for lots of different reasons, some technical, some business-driven, we find organizations kind of hosting their main compute platform on with one vendor, maybe doing DR or business continuity with another, to have that sort of company separation or boundary, and being able to test across them all is very powerful. So you'll find within Dome9 the ability to do just that, to run a compliance assessment across disparate platforms. Now, of course, those listening who are familiar with the three services that certainly we support, AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud Platform, there are different capabilities within each. So, some of these concepts like security groups are similar. I think I'd argue if you have familiarity with Google Cloud Platform, they're not even called security groups, but the concepts are the same, right? So you can write a compliance framework that tests that equally across all three platforms. But then there will be some hosted services like RDS or like Lambda, although we hear that is coming from an Azure perspective, it won't operate exactly the same. So some rules can get very specific and be platform specific, and some rules can transcend common concepts whereby they're applicable across all three platforms. So I think Dome9 strikes that balance very well.
Thank you, Patrick. It looks like we have time for maybe one more question, and the question is there an easy way to build rules and control compliance automation based on region requirements?
Actually, I will echo that as a really good question, Patrick. I'd like to hear more about, because we are scaling into that based on different types of regions and how we need to do different reporting and compliance requirements based upon, say, different privacy rules in Australia versus the data rules in the EU, et cetera.
Sure. Yeah, and I think, from a region perspective, there's a global region, and then there's supported region of your infrastructure as a service platform. And if you recall in the last screen share portion where I went through the actual compliance engine, there's two ways of solving this problem, right? I can take my generalized rule set, either an off-the-shelf one, as you saw me do with our HIPAA safeguards, or something I've built myself using GSL within Dome9, and I can run that for a particular region, right? So I can get my generalized rules ran really anywhere I need. That's probably the most straightforward way of doing it, at least quickly from a regional perspective. But then to make sure that we're complying with regional rules that may not be globally applicable, we can actually write that into the rule itself. So I can say in any particular region, and this is all using GSL to express this kind of desire to measure my baseline. I can say, look, for example, if you do disaster recovery in a region that has different mandates in terms of information retention, you can say, look, in my Ireland region where I do DR, make sure that I'm rotating credentials at a different rate or a different pace than I am everywhere else. You can actually write that regional requirement right into the rule itself, right? And then you have one bundle of rules that goes out and makes sure in each region that you're doing kind of the correct things based on either your desire or the framework of the data security standard you're trying to adhere to. So multiple ways of satisfying that interest in that requirement. I think it depends a little bit on how strict you want to be.
Excellent. Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Eric. All right, we're at the finish line for today's webinar, and as we're closing this webinar, I'd like to thank everybody in our audience for joining us today, and I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Also, many thanks to Eric Hoffman of Datastream Connexion for sharing your unique insights on cloud security and compliance automation. Many thanks also to Patrick Pushor from Dome9 for your presentation and demonstration of the Dome9 compliance engine for HIPAA test suite scenario and your best practices for compliance automation. All right, everyone, this concludes today's webinar. If you have any further questions on the information presented today, please don't hesitate to reach us and reach out to us via email. And the best email address is Q&A@dome9.com. So that's Q-A-N-D-A, Q&A at dome9.com. If you enjoyed the webinar presented today, and if you'd like to learn more about Dome9 and even experience the Dome9 Arc platform for yourself, we are offering a 14-day free trial. Please visit our website at www.dome9.com and click on the Get Started button on our homepage. Just register, and a representative from Dome9 will contact you to activate your free trial. Additionally, if you'd like the webinar today, and if you'd like to hear more about public multi-cloud security solutions that Dome9 provides, please visit the resources page on our website and sign up for one or more of our upcoming webinars. If there's a topic you'd like us to discuss, please contact us through the website and let us know. You will also receive a follow-up email with links to today's webinar recording. And again, please feel free to download the PDFs posted on the GoToWebinar handout section, particularly the Dome9 Compliance and Governance Product Brief and the Dome9 Datastream Connexion Case Study. With that, we thank you for your time today and hope you found the content of this webinar informative. This now concludes the Dome9 webinar, and I hope we will see you again at one of our future webinars. Thanks, everyone.